So
did I tell you we host a Hasidic class here on Tuesdays?
I did not know that. No, I know Rabbi Naim gave a shir. I didn't know it was in your house.
I'm sorry. Yeah, we host it every Tuesday night.
Nice.
7 o'clock.
Nice, very nice.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
So
You gave a shir last night.
The shir was on the whole interaction with Moshe and the angels about getting the Torah, and
fantastic.
the rabbi's mimer about how he polishes up what the sages said about the 5 reasons. Yeah.
Fantastic. Who gave the class?
Rabbi Abinayim gives it every Tuesday.
Fantastic. All right. So today we're going to learn about the custom of eating milchiks, eating dairy on Shavuos. So many reasons that were given for this, as Alter writes in Shulchan Aruch. I just saw yesterday, Shmuel Einstein showed me page Chafei. It says one reason that the Mishnah Berurah says why we eat milchiks is because it's very hard to Torah was given, so we had to suddenly prepare food. So it's hard to prepare meat because you have to slaughter it and prepare it. So it's much easier to have dairy. That's what the Mishnah Berurah says. But the Rebbe says much more. The Rebbe says Shavuos was on Shabbos, so it's impossible to shacht on Shabbos anyways. So Schweizer showing that Ber 11 says that the reason maybe that Mishnah Berurah doesn't say that is because the Rebbe writes in one sikha that's possible to say. I don't think it's a conclusion, but there is a possibility to say that Shabbos is an indivisible point, and therefore if part of Shabbos wasn't Shabbos, then the whole Shabbos doesn't have the same. There's such a svar, there's such a possible opinion that if it's part of Shabbos isn't Shabbos, and the rest of Shabbos doesn't have the same status as Shabbos. And therefore, it could be according to Mishnah Berurah, they were allowed to slaughter the animals on Shabbos because the beginning of Shabbos didn't have the same status as the Shabbos after giving the Torah, even though they had the mitzvah Shabbos Gemara. Anyways, so there are many reasons why we eat dairy. Another reason we eat dairy is because it says that when Moshe Rabbeinu was placed as a baby in the Nile River and discovered by the daughter of the Pharaoh, and he was brought to all these Egyptian nursemaids refused to have milk from them, then they had to call Moshe and his mother, and Moshe was able to have milk from his mother. So what day was that? That day was 3 months after Moshe was born. Moshe was born on the 7th of Adar. So it comes out the day of Shavuos, when Moshe received the Torah from Hashem, was the same day that he had milk from his mother. Another reason that's given. Another reason that's given is because the angels, when they were at Avminu's tent, they ate milk and meat together. And one of the reputations of the angels, they are saying they deserve the Torah, is the fact that we are careful about separating milk and meat. The angels weren't. Therefore, we eat dairy food. Another reason, simple reason, because the Torah is compared to milk. It says in the Torah, "Dvash v'cholov tachas hasheni." The Torah is called milk and honey under your tongue. So these are the many reasons, among the many reasons that are said about why we eat milchiks. But here, the Rebbe is going to ask about why do we need many reasons? And because there are many reasons that make a difference anyways. So if there's one reason, and if there are no reasons, we do because Hashem said so. Well, why is there an emphasis over here in Shulchan Aruch that there are many reasons for this? The Seif Gimel, Seif Chos Pesach Siman Tav Tzaddik Dal Kesef Ben Azaf. The end of the laws of Pesach, the Alter writes, "Neigem Chol Kemes Chol 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 V'Yemech Shavuos, and Yosin Teirihi Keharbin Tam Nemra Allah." It's customary in all places to eat dairy foods on day 1 of Shavuos. This is a custom of our forefathers, and therefore, since it's a custom of our ancestors, it is Torah. Because, says the Alter Rebbe, many reasons are said about this. You hear this? The language of Dr. Chaim Peretz.
Yes.
It's a custom of our forefathers because there are many reasons. So the question is, what this means simply is, Alter Rebbe is encouraging this custom. Why? Because there are many reasons for this. If one of the reasons isn't oisgehalten, if one of the reasons isn't correct, The other reasons, there are many reasons. It does make sense, understood. If it's a Jewish custom, doesn't matter if there are many reasons or there is one reason. In fact, the Rebbe has mentioned this here, but the Rashba said that if there are 1,000 reasons why not to fulfill the custom of old Jewish bubbies, you cannot take away the custom. Jewish bubbies are doing something, that's Torah. Doesn't matter if we understand it or not. That's why it's custom to sing to your children, because that's what all Jewish bubbies have been doing for 1,000 years. So, what's the reason that the author emphasizes that there are many reasons? The question is even greater, because the author of his source is from the Magen Avram. There in the Magen Avram, the language of the Magen Avram is there are many reasons, and the custom of our forefathers is Torah. Okay, so that time, the Ramah says we dairy on the first day of Shavuos, and he writes a reason. So the Magen Avram comments on the Ramah, and he says there are many reasons, and then he concludes and says the custom of our forefathers is Torah. That's what the Magen Avram does in the Code of Jewish Law. But the Alter Rebbe, whose source is from Magen Avram, he veers from the language of the Magen Avram. The Alter Rebbe changes the order around. First of all, he says it's a custom of our forefathers. And then he adds, because there are many reasons for this. It sounds like the Alter Rebbe is saying, why should we do this custom? It sounds like because there are many reasons for it. Do this custom, the Alter Rebbe says, because there are many reasons. Even if there would be only one reason, the custom of our forefathers is still Torah. The Alter Rebbe is very precise. He doesn't use the language of the source he's quoting from, and he says it's a custom of our forefathers because there are many reasons. It sounds like do this because there are many reasons. If there weren't all these reasons, you shouldn't do it. What's going on over here? We do these things because this is a custom of Jewish people. It doesn't matter if there's one reason, there's many reasons, there are no reasons. But the Alter Rebbe says, no, do this, it's a Jewish custom because there are many reasons. What's going on? To understand this, we first have to explain the language that our sages always use about Jewish customs. The custom of the Jewish people is Torah. That's the language our sages use. Why do our sages say the custom of the Jewish people is Torah? There's a custom that you have to do. You have to eat dairy foods on Shavuos. There are other customs. The customs of Rosh Chodesh, the customs of Hanukkah, the customs of things that we do, and the customs of things that we don't do. Like, for example, women have a minhag not to do any work at the time of the counting of the Yom. So it would seem the more appropriate language should be it's a mitzvah, it's an obligation, but not Torah, because Torah is about something that you're studying. So it should have said the custom of the Jewish people is an obligation. The custom of the Jewish people is a mitzvah to do with the custom of the Jewish people. But that's not what our sages say. They say the custom of the Jewish people is Torah. We're not learning anything. We're talking about doing something, talking about working, not working, talking about eating, not eating, whatever the custom is. So it's about something that's in our behavior. It's about our behavior in the end zone for the touchdown. Thank you very much. So why do we call this a Torah? The custom of Jewish people is Torah. See, the custom of Jewish people is an obligation. Why it's called Torah? He says, so understand this by first prefacing one of the differences between Torah and mitzvahs. Mitzvahs yana mechad. All mitzvahs have the same theme. What's a mitzvah? It's God's commandment. Before we do any mitzvah, we say the same blessing. Blessed are you, Lord our God, who has sanctified us with his commandments, and he's commanded us. There are differences in the special gift that each mitzvah gives us, and the spiritual remedy that each mitzvah accomplishes. Yesh kula miches mitzvah. When you put on tefillin, you draw down from the spheres, from the higher spheres to the lower spheres, from chachmina and das to midas. There are many schools, many impacts that tefillin has, both in ourselves and in the higher worlds. And by tefillin impacting the higher worlds, it's something that happens over here as well. Starts whatever happens in Asiya starts off in Atzilus. What do they say to Rebbe? Whatever happens in Los Angeles starts in Las Vegas. Anyways, whatever happens in this world starts off in Atzilus. So there's a special skula, the special impact that tefillin has in this world. It starts off with the impact of tefillin in the higher worlds. It says also about the sacrifices. That one animal is brought to Hashem, and that causes an elevation in the energy of all the animals of the world. One measure of flour mixed with oil is offered on the altar, and that elevates all the inanimate, all the vegetation. The case of the Hashem, so too all mitzvahs have an impact on the world. That's the impact of mitzvahs. But the way we do mitzvahs is the same. We do all mitzvahs because God said so. Okay, it's just a caveat over here. The reason we're doing them is because God said so. However, we're also supposed to think about the reason for them. And the reason definitely animates us differently when we think about the reason for the mitzvah. But the underlying purpose of doing a mitzvah, the main component of each mitzvah is the will of Hashem. And therefore, the way to approach a mitzvah is to do the will of Hashem. But Torah is not like that. Mitzvahs are all the same. Every mitzvah is the will of Hashem. Torah is something that you understand. That's what Torah is about. Torah is called the wisdom of the Jewish people, the wisdom even to the eyes of the Gentiles, especially the oral Torah. It says that the oral Torah, if you don't understand what you're learning, it's not considered learning. Therefore, in Torah, there is an emphasis on not the singularity of Torah, like mitzvahs, they're all so the singular theme, the will of Hashem. In Torah, there's an emphasis on there being a lot of division, there being a multitude of ideas. Torah is not about one singular point. In one singular point, you cannot have understanding. Rather, in Torah, there's an emphasis on the parts and the division and the details of Torah. The multitude of details and the abundance of ideas in Torah. That's what Torah is about, understanding. There is a concept of Torah also where we find there is an inclusion of many things in one. For example, the Ten Commandments. Sadi Goyen says that the reason why there are 620 letters in the Ten Commandments is because there are 613 mitzvahs of the Torah, and there's 7 laws of the rabbis. That's why there's 620 letters in the Ten Commandments. So all the mitzvahs are included in the Ten Commandments, and Tzadi Goyen explains how that works. And Baal Shem Tov says even more. Baal Shem Tov is Hilula, his day of passings on Shavuos. He says all the Ten Commandments are further included within the very first word of the Ten Commandments. The word of Anechi, they're even included in the first letter of the Aleph of Anechi. So too, everything in Torah has one point that is equal in the entire Torah. The halacha is if one letter is missing in the Sefer Torah, the whole Torah is invalid. Why is it invalid? Because there's something that is similar in every part of the Torah. All the Torah is connected to each other. There is a nekuda, there is a point that permeates all of Torah. Okay, so that's true. There is something in Torah that is the Kometz Aleph Ah, as we're learning that earlier this week, the Kometz Aleph Ah Anechi includes the entire Torah. That's true. So the whole Torah is included in the Kometz Aleph Ah. The whole Torah is included in one point. There is something similar in each letter of the Torah, and that's why if one letter is missing, the whole Torah is not invalid, because there is something that is similar in every part of the Torah. There is one akuda. There's one point that goes to the whole Torah. So why are we differentiating the entire mitzvahs? It seems the Torah is a similar thing. Avol, next page. That's true, but that's not the logic of Torah. We're talking about the impact of the intimacy that Hashem comes close to us when we study Torah. It says in Tanya that the reason why we refer to the reading of the Torah, the calling of the Torah, sounds like we're Indians. Why call it the calling of the Torah? The Alter Rebbe says that when a Jew learns Torah, he's calling, like a child calling his father to be with him. So the underlying theme that all the Torah is connected to is this idea of we're calling Hashem. The whole Torah is about a Jew calling Hashem to be with him. And therefore, even someone who does not understand the Torah also is the bracha before reading the Torah, because he is still doing the same thing. He's still calling Hashem to be with him. So that's the calling of Torah. Torah is about the closeness with Hashem. There is an element of Torah. There's a deeper element of Torah, which is about us calling Hashem to be with us. And that's equal in every letter in the Torah, whether the letter is in the word Esav, or the word Chazer, or Lahavdil, the word Anechi. It's all the same essential point of us calling Hashem. However, that's not the logic in Torah. That's not the ideas in Torah. We're talking about the logic of Torah, the understanding of Torah. The fact that Torah is called our wisdom and our understanding to the eyes of the Gentiles. There, the emphasis is yes, that there is a multitude of ideas in Torah. There's a plurality in Torah. There's so many different things in Torah. There is an emphasis on the division, of the separation, of a multitude of ideas in Torah. Hashem doesn't want us just to read the Torah, just to say the words of Torah. He wants us to understand it too. Language of Kabbalah, Hashem doesn't just want us to have the inner dimension of Atik. Hashem wants us to also have the inner dimension of Abba. Abba is a source of wisdom. Hashem doesn't just want us to connect with Torah just like this calling to Hashem in the letters of Torah. Hashem wants us to understand Torah too. That's a mitzvah. Okay, so this is all an intro to help us understand why we say the custom of our forefathers is Torah. Why don't we say the custom of our forefathers is an obligation? Why do we say it's Torah? Now that we've established the difference between Torah and mitzvahs, that Torah is unlike mitzvahs. In mitzvahs, there's one theme that permeates all of mitzvahs, all the will of Hashem. However, Torah is not like that. In Torah, there are many, many different things. There's a sea of Torah. It sounds like the mitzvahs are on a higher level. Mitzvahs is the will of Hashem, and Torah is in the realm of logic, and therefore Torah is divisible. The truth is, the reason why Torah has so many concepts within it is precisely because of the virtue that Torah has that surpasses mitzvahs. Also, Yadua. A mitzvah is the will of Hashem. Torah is also connected. Torah, which is about understanding, is also connected to pleasure, to God's pleasure. What's the difference? In desire is indivisible. When you want something, there is the same. The male Tzibur always say, desire means your soul is drawn to something. Doesn't matter what it's drawn to. In desire, you are drawn to something. It's about you going out of yourself, being drawn to something. The nefesh sits, that's desire. If you decided you're going to finish a book of Gemara, a whole tractate of Gemara, until you finish the last page, you haven't fulfilled your desire at all, even though you did most of it. But the desire is indivisible. Desire is about, I want to finish the tractate. Until I finish the tractate, I haven't done anything. But pleasure is not like that. Pleasure is divisible. There are different kinds of pleasure. You can't compare the pleasure you have from seeing something or hearing something. The different kinds of pleasure. The different pleasure of enjoying music, let's say, or seeing artwork, or seeing a beautiful scenery. Or the pleasure you have from discovering a deep idea in Torah. And then there's a pleasure you have from the depth of your soul. It's each kind of pleasure, the pleasure of music, the pleasure of things you see, the pleasure of understanding, the pleasure of the deepest part of your soul. These are all different. The pleasure is made of different stuff, different essence. Desire is all the same. Pleasure is different. There are different kinds of pleasure. Therefore, since a mitzvah is about the will of Hashem, therefore all mitzvahs are the same. All mitzvahs are the same component, the same major ingredient, which is the desire of Hashem. Torah, which is about pleasure, Torah has a multitude of ideas, and there's a lot of it's divisible. It's divisible. That's what our sages meant when they said, when God gave us a Torah, after he concluded each sentence, our neshamas left us. Why did neshamas leave us after we heard the first sentence and we heard the second one? If it's such an overwhelming experience because of what God said, because of God speaking to us, so what was novel about God's second word? In other words, if we were revived in a way that we could handle God's first revelation, so then what was unique about the second revelation that made our souls leave us again? Similarly, the revelation of Hashem after we passed away from the first revelation, the first sentence of God giving us there, and now we're revived and you can handle that. So how come our souls left us again by the second sentence? The answer is, in each sentence, the Ten Commandments, there was a different kind of pleasure that was expressed in those words, which is not the same as the pleasure of the other one. Even after God returned his souls to us, after the first sentence, so when we heard the second sentence, which was a different sentence, a different kind of pleasure, Hashem invested a different kind of pleasure in the second sentence, that also overwhelmed us again, and Hashem has left us a second time. So Torah, which is about pleasure, is about division. Please move on. Now could explain our question. Now could explain why we say the custom of our forefathers. We don't say it's an obligation. We don't say it's a mitzvah. We say it's Torah. Why do we say it's Torah? This is meant to teach us Yisrael, even those Jewish customs, which are not written about in the written Torah, and they're not discussed in the oral Torah, even those customs which are not in the books, they're not in the Mishnah, they're not in the written Torah, they are also at the level of Torah. They're also the level of understanding. They also have pleasure, not just desire. They also have Torah in them. They also have understanding in them. They also have a geschmack in them. They also have pleasure in them, not just the desire of Hashem. Not just we do the customs of our forefathers because Hashem said so. It's true, but it's Torah. What does it mean? It's Torah. It means you could break it apart and you could dissect it. You could understand it because it's Torah and it has this element of pleasure in it. And pleasure, as we said, is different than desire. Desire is indivisible, but pleasure is divisible. And therefore, each custom has its own kind of geschmack and own understanding. And that's why what the author is hinting to us in his veering from the language of the Magen Avraham. The author says, eating milchus on Shavuos is Torah because there are many reasons for it. He's first he says it's a Jewish custom, and then he says there are many reasons for it. First he says the custom of our forefathers and it's Torah, and then he says because there are many reasons. What's the author trying to say? Why do we eat milchus on Shavuos? We eat dairy food on Shavuos because of the geschmack of Torah. Torah is compared to milk. Torah is compared to honey. As the Torah says, it is milk and honey under your tongue. So the pleasure of Torah is connected to the understanding of Torah. Because of the geschmack of Torah, that's why Torah descends to understanding. So the author says that this virtue in Torah that the Torah is geschmack, the Torah has pleasure, and therefore the Torah there has division. The Torah, just like pleasure, there are different kinds of pleasure, and you can't compare the different kinds of pleasure, things you see, things you hear, and things you understand, all different kinds of pleasure. So too, the Jewish customs have this element of pleasure in them, and therefore there are many reasons for Jewish customs. Even in Jewish customs, there is the geschmack, there is a sweetness of the Torah. And since Jewish customs has a sweetness of Torah, therefore they also have many reasons. Just like we said before, if it's geschmack, if it's pleasure, pleasure is divisible. Those different kinds of pleasure. And the pleasure of Torah, is a source for the understanding of Torah, the many different concepts in Torah. The mitzvahs are all the same. Mitzvahs are the will of Hashem. But Torah is connected to the tainu, the pleasure of Hashem. And therefore, there's so many different things there. It's palatable, so many different things there. And therefore, even Jewish customs that Alter Rebbe emphasized, which are not written in the Gemara, which are not written in the Torah, they're also Torah. They also have many reasons because they also originate from the pleasure of Torah. That's why the Alter Rebbe emphasized, let me conclude over here. That's why Alter Rebbe emphasized this in the laws of Shavuos specifically. Why does he say this about Shavuos? Because some people say that it's enough to receive the Torah with joy and inspiration, but not Jewish customs. Jewish customs, you don't need to have the joy and inspiration for Jewish customs. The Torah in general, the written Torah, the oral Torah, the Gemara, the Jewish customs, you don't need to accept them too with joy and inspiration. Therefore, the Alter Rebbe emphasizes that when he talks about the custom of being dairy food and Shavuos, he emphasizes that there is pleasure and joy in the Jewish custom to teach us when we accept the Torah on Shavuos, we're also accepting the Jewish customs, which they're part of Torah, and they have many reasons because they're connected to the pleasure of Torah. Yes, okay.
Okay. So you said that pleasure is divisible according to our sensibility to sense. You said also that Torah is non-divisible. If you're missing a letter or comments, it's not Torah.
Very good. So there's two parts of Torah. There is the intimacy in Torah. There is the connection to God's essence in Torah, and beyond understanding, beyond the logic of Torah. Then there is the logic of Torah. The logic of Torah is yes, it is divisible. There are many different concepts in Torah. So if we're talking about the connection you make with Hashem when you study Torah, so then there's no difference between whatever verse you're reading. It doesn't matter to understand it at all. Just you're saying the words of Torah. You're like a child calling your father to come, calling his father to come. But beyond that, Hashem wants us not just to have previous aspect, not just to have this deep connection to essence. He wants us to bring that into our understanding, and that element, understanding part, that comes from the pleasure of it. The understanding comes from the pleasure of it. There is another deeper part of Torah, which is you're connecting your essence to Hashem's essence by saying the letters of Torah. That's the equal in the whole Torah. But then there is the pleasure in Torah, and that's different. Each word of Torah has a different kind of pleasure. That's why when we heard the second sentence of Hashem's left us again, because it was different kind of pleasure than experienced by the first sentence. All right. I just want to one more line about what we asked yesterday. About teaching Torah to Gentiles. I want to emphasize that we looked at the others that anyone who honors Torah, it says their body is honored by people. So the Rebbe said that the author of this teaching, who was Rabbi Yossi, he had to defend the Torah to some Roman noblewoman had all these questions about Torah, and he answered the questions. The reason he answered the questions was because he was defending the honor of it. So the difference between a non-Jew studying Torah, what they're doing, versus you who are defending the honor of Torah, there's no obligation to defend the honor of Torah. So although she was asking what things which weren't relevant to her at all, but in order to honor Torah, he desired to answer a question. So it's not just a black and white, only the 7 laws, nothing else. There's also a concept of defending the honor of Torah.